I am delighted to introduce our last speaker for the day, Paul Michael Johnson, who is Associate Professor, Research Professor of Spanish in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at Johns Hopkins. To date, his excellent and rich scholarship has drawn primarily on the history of emotion, the senses, the body, as well as on performance, as different but interrelated sites of racial and gendered othering in early modern literary culture. He has also written on such topics as translation, film, public monuments, and popular culture, and he frequently places pre-modern Iberia in conversation with global issues and concerns and 21st century debates. Dr. Johnson is the author of Effective Geographies, Cervantes, Emotion, and the Literary Mediterranean, which was published by Toronto in 2021. This award-winning book, it was distinguished as an outstanding academic title by choice, is a wonderful, highly interdisciplinary contribution to Cervantes and Cervantine studies, and it charts Cervantes' hold or imprint on Mediterranean culture lasting until today, while also studying emotional response and Cervantes' own varied Mediterranean experience, all of which have combined to make him a key figure through which the literary Mediterranean can be better assessed and better understood. Dr. Johnson is also the co-editor of 2 volumes, Cervantine Futures, Reading Cervantes After the Critical Turn, edited alongside Nicholas Jones and forthcoming from Vanderbilt, as well as Cervantes in Transit, Studies in Honor of Francisco Lainarantz, which was edited with Elizabeth Neary and Chad Leahy, who I need to say was a graduate from Brown in Hispanic Studies. And this project is forthcoming from the University of Delaware Press. Dr. Johnson's research has also been published in peer-reviewed journals like PMLA, Renaissance Quarterly, where he recently published a beautiful and rigorous article that I highly recommend, At First Blush, Race, Rouge, and the Transnational Performance of Turning Red, that follows the blush and tracks the act of blushing across geographic, national, literary, and conceptual boundaries to disclose new perspectives on pre-modern race-making. His work has also been published in Atlantic Studies, Bulletin of Spanish Studies, MLN, Exemplaria, the Norton Critical Edition of Don Quixote, Soundscapes of the Early Modern Hispanophone and Lusophone Worlds, among many other venues. He also authored the critical introduction to the first modern edition of Luis Vélez de Guevara's Celoso, Amor y Venganza, which is fantastic. And Dr. Johnson's current book project has the working title, Scarlet Insurgencies, Blushing and Race-Making in the Global Renaissance, and it builds on his experience in emotion, gesture, and the body as intensified sites of cultural othering. It argues that long before a 19th century fascination with blushing in literature and biological sciences, the Renaissance was pivotal in expanding, legislating, and transforming the meanings of the blush, as well as construing it as a marker of racial difference. And his research has been supported by the Fulbright, by Harvard's Houghton Library, the Race Before Race Second Book Institute, and the Great Lakes College Association and Mellon Foundation. And so today, drum roll please also, he will be as of 2026, the new author, or the new editor of Cervantes Journal, and the talk that he is sharing with us today is exciting new work, Cervantes' Castrato, an aria of early modern race and disability. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Alani, for that wonderfully generous introduction, as well as the invitation to be here today. Thank you also to Rachel, Ben, and the rest of the Cogut staff for all of their generous labor in organizing this fantastically generative event, and to my co-panelists for the opportunity to learn from them, and for all of you for being here. I couldn't help but notice, sitting here, the musical motif scattered about this beautiful space, and I found it a fitting preview of the musical focus of my remarks today. So, Miguel de Cervantes suffered the effects of both violent physical impairment. He lost the use of his left hand from a harquebus wound sustained at the 1571 Battle of Lepanto, as well as the ableist discrimination that resulted from that injury, most famously in Alonso Fernández de Avellaneda's unauthorized sequel to Don Quixote, which mocked and disparaged the war veteran's wounds. Yet in the prologue to his own sequel of 1615, Cervantes resignifies the epithet of manco de lepanto as disability gain, a point of soldierly pride, and what Elizabeth Bearden, in her recent book of the same name, calls Crip authority. Along similar lines, Alani Hicks-Bartlett has observed that, quote, while Cervantes is widely recognized as an author preoccupied with the body, a point of inquiry that has been persistently overlooked in critical literature is how his authorial voice not only proclaims an interest in bodily matters, but also overtly privileges bodily difference, end quote. Exemplary of these tendencies, as I would like to explore here today, is a character named Luis and described as an, quote, old black eunuch in Cervantes' novella El celoso extremeño, or The Jealous Man from Extremadura, first published in the 1613 collection of novelas ejemplares, or exemplary novellas. In brief, the short story recounts how the titular character, Felipe de Carrizales, makes a fortune in the Indies before settling in Seville, where, despite his advanced age, he marries Leonora, a teenage girl from a poor local family. Consumed by pathological jealousy and paranoia, he secludes his adolescent bride, erecting high walls and sealing off the windows to insulate her from the gaze of prying eyes, which ironically piques the desire of Loaisa, a dashing young suitor who plots to penetrate the domestic fortress. Wielding melody as a key to unlock its doors and disarm its protections, he uses his musical skills to beguile Carrizales' servants, beginning with the enslaved Luis, the only non-female member of the household, and who resides in the hayloft of an antechamber. Once inside the home, Loaisa fails in his efforts to seduce Leonora, but Carrizales finds them asleep in each other's arms, and the shock of the presumptive betrayal soon proves mortal to the jealous old man. The narrative concludes with Leonora entering a convent and Loaisa fleeing to the New World, suggesting a narrative circularity by which, like Carrizales, the deceptive Lothario too might extract immense wealth from the Indies. In a sense, Luis also comes full circle, though the narrator makes a point to note that Carrizales manumits his eunuch porter and other enslaved servants. Luis's future will be for readers as obscure as his past. Whether Luis's heritage derives from northern, western, or sub-Saharan Africa, and whether he might have resided on the American continent before accompanying Carrizales on his return voyage to Spain, are questions left unanswered by the narrative. His eunuchism further obscures any effort to get a definitive fix on his hypothetical origins. Eunuchs, both black and white, routinely safeguarded Ottoman seraglios and harems, and given Cervantes' own intimate experience in the Maghreb and Eastern Mediterranean, as well as other details in the narrative, critics have allegorized Carrizales' zealously shielded home as a sultan's palace, casting Luis as the Kislar Agassi, or chief eunuch. Today, I want to advocate for understanding Luis not as an allegorical representation of Ottoman culture, but instead in the context of Iberia's own domestic populations of black Africans and castrated males. Building on textual descriptions of his high-pitched voice and musical interests, in particular, I propose reading Luis as a castrato, connecting him to a vibrant but understudied network of Afro-diasporic musicians active in early modern Spanish liturgical, courtly, and popular venues. Through what I call creative auscultation, building on Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation, I listen to Luis's voice in ways that resist the erasure of Spain's involvement in enslavement and emasculation. And finally, I propose a spectrum approach to castrati that moves beyond binary distinctions between professional and amateur, or ability and disability, demonstrating how Luis's vocal capacity represents disability gain rather than mere loss or compensation, and how his intersectional position as an enslaved, black, disabled musician reveals the complex convergences of race, disability, and musical labor in early modern Iberia. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the brilliant pioneering scholarship by disability studies scholars, including those who form part of this event, that have opened up and continue to shape the field, and whose work enables me to pursue these lines of inquiry. So I've been thinking and writing a lot about this particular character for a number of years, mainly in relationship to race and intersectionality, And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity here to explore in greater depth Luis's relationship to disability. The multiple identities occupied by this minor character, along with his physical and symbolic positioning in the narrative, make Luis eminently intersectional and a far more interesting and elaborate figure than the dearth of pre-existing scholarship on him would suggest. Though Cervantes' text declines to supply an origin or backstory for Luis, his designation as a negro viejo y eunuco, or old black eunuch, would have been sufficient to trigger an array of associations in the minds of early modern readers. Within the term eunuch itself nest four major axes of identity: sexuality, gender, race, and ability. Carrizales appears to presume that Luis will neither pique the sexual interest of his young bride nor desire her for himself. Given the jealous old man's paranoid suspicion of other men, the strictly feminine quality of his household, and its resemblance to an Ottoman harem, scholars have typically assumed that Luis's access hinges on his gender. But thinking about the character intersectionally, and therefore about how other categories of identity were routinely denigrated as ugly, monstrous, and undesirable, suggests that his suitability as a sexually non-threatening member of Carrizales' tightly controlled enclave might just as well relate to assessments of his race, age, a presumed physical deformity, or a combination thereof. Indeed, the compounding of racial and disability-based assumptions about desirability reveals how certain bodies are marked as categorically excluded from sexual and romantic possibility. Luis's confinement reflects not merely Carrizales' jealousy, but broader social logics that render racialized, disabled bodies simultaneously hypersexualized as objects of prurient curiosity or anxiety, and desexualized as unworthy of desire, intimacy, or partnership. Yet the intersection of anti-Black racism with assumptions about eunuchs' disability creates compound effects that require careful attention. How does the racialized stereotype of Black musicality, which Cervantes parrots elsewhere in the narrative, interact with the presumption that eunuchs are simultaneously sexually deficient and excessive? How do white anxieties about Black hypersexuality converge with or contradict beliefs about castrated men's asexuality? For Luis, these overlapping stereotypes create unique vulnerabilities. He is simultaneously hypervisible as spectacle, as racial other, as disabled body, and invisible as property, as confined to liminal spaces. The surveillance he experiences is not merely architectural but ideological, produced by interlocking systems of racial and ableist oppression that mark his body as both exotic commodity and abject other. A eunuch by definition would imply a genitally altered individual, usually through varying surgical means, and a correspondingly diminished sexual potency and functionality. Yet there were significant historical variations in terms of method and outcomes. For example, castration could signify the complete ablation of the genitals or a more limited procedure of testicular removal. These and similar variations meant that, though sterile, many castrates were capable of sexual activity, such that eunuchs belong on a more inclusive and nuanced spectrum of disability. Prepubertal castration could lead to a number of physiological traits, some of which were readily visible, such as sallow skin, elongated limbs, and larger hips and breasts, or audible, such as a high tessitura. This was for castrati, of course, both the purpose of their castration and reason for their privileged status, and as a salient feature of Luis's voice as well, to which I will return in a moment. In Juan Huarte de San Juan's highly popular 1575 treatise on humoralism, Examen de Ingenios, or Examination of Men's Wits, the early physician remarks on the effects of castration and the cold, dry disposition of those who have undergone the procedure. And I'll read the English translation. Indeed, we see through experience that afterwards their body hair and beard fall out, their thick and bulky voices become thin, and with this they lose their force and natural color and end up in worse condition and more miserable than if they were women. But what is most important to note is that if before they castrate a man he has much wit and ability, after the testicles are cut, he comes to lose it as if in the very brain he had received some serious injury. Huarte's aspersions reveal not merely individual prejudice, but a broader ableist ideology that equates physical difference with cognitive deficiency, moral degradation, and diminished humanity. Huarte's assertion that eunuchs surrender their ingenio, wit, intelligence, creativity, exposes how disability was understood through frameworks of loss, damage, and incompleteness, an ableist devaluation compounded by the gender dimension of Huarte's comparison of eunuchs to women. His rhetoric also reveals anxieties about productivity and usefulness. Eunuchs are constructed as failures of masculinist potency, rationality, and procreative duty, while the linking of disability to moral and intellectual deficiency conflates bodily difference with personal inadequacy. Huarte's treatise proves that beyond the degree to which eunuchs were physically disabled, they were also subject to attitudinal hostility and disparaging treatment in the social realm. Indeed, beyond biomedical or physical impairment are the ways in which Luis is socially disabled by the structures and spatial arrangements that constrain him, and by ideologies that construct certain bodies as deficient, deviant, or dangerous. I interpret Luis's confinement to the vestibule, a threshold space between domestic interior and public exterior, as more than symbolic liminality. It is architectural control that produces disability through restricted movement, social isolation, and perpetual surveillance. The built environment of Carrizales' fortress disables Luis by denying him spatial autonomy and confining him to a socially marginalized zone where he can neither fully enter the private household nor freely access the public street. And as a side note, this is an important difference with Black eunuchs in the Ottoman seraglio, who were permitted to transit in and out of spaces prohibited to other men, and who facilitated access across both physical and spiritual borders. So Catherine Crawford has a recent, very useful and rich book on eunuchs and castrati, but she focuses almost exclusively on the Ottoman context with regards to race in particular. So we would think of harem guards, right, like castrati as an enabling view of castration, right? Access to power, access to the sultan. But I'm suggesting that this is a broader limitation in disability-centered approaches. And I'll get to that reframing here in just a moment. Hamid Arvas has observed how some Ottoman eunuchs voluntarily opted to undergo castration and thus to embrace an available means of gender transition and nonconformity, while Emily Wilborn has similarly shown how, quote, the voluntary castrato is quintessentially queer, for he slips between the cracks of heteronormativity. He modifies his body to suit his desire, and he abdicates the procreative responsibilities of the heterosexual, end quote. Yet even if castration historically was performed to remedy various medical illnesses, the fact of Luis's enslavement almost certainly means that he would have exercised no consent over the surgical alterations to his body, manifesting once again the intersections between gender, race, and ability. On the one hand, this absence of consent is central to understanding Luis's disability within the framework of enslavement and other forms of systemic violence. Enslavement transforms the body itself into a site of coerced medical intervention, where disabled identities are produced through force and the stripping of bodily autonomy, practices that implicate systems of human trafficking and colonial violence. The intersection of race and disability in Luis reflects how enslaved people were systematically denied control over their own bodies and even the alterations performed upon their flesh. On the other hand, I want to ask what it would mean to move beyond a medical model and think about Luis in the context of disability gain. Due to the visually hermetic isolation of Carrizales' residence, Loaiza and Luis's initial encounters are sightless, with the latter overhearing from within the vestibule the guitar and lyric melodies of the seductive musician in the street outside. Foreshadowing the emphasis on the vocal organs that will emerge later in the novella, Loaiza approaches the door under the pretense that he cannot sing because of a dry throat. Unlike sight, sound does not require a direct line to be apprehended. Acousmatic, it boasts the advantage, and in this case the danger, of passing through walls. Loaiza appeals to the acoustic realm not just because he is adept at music and because his talent will serve to ingratiate himself among the servants whose aid is indispensable for gaining entry to the home, but because in essence, hearing is the only practical sense available for doing so. After Loaiza vanquishes the property's first line of defense by helping Luis to stealthily immobilize the lock and latch, their musicking fills the vestibule with song. The airtight acoustics of its interior transfigure the hayloft into a kind of pulmonary space that, like the chest cavity of a singer, reverberates with melodic vibrations perceptible to those outside its walls. These are just a few of the multiple details in the narrative that emphasize sound, orality, and vocality. And Luis participates meaningfully in the sonic and vocal interplay. Loaysa tells him, quote, "I have heard that you have very good abilities, and from what I sense and can judge by the organ of your voice, which is high-pitched, you must sing very well," a compliment that Luis humbly accepts by responding, "I don't sing poorly." In a bid to secure Luis as his musical pupil and thus to secure entry to the jealous old man's impregnable abode, Loaysa further charms him by stating that, quote, "It would be a great pity to lose a voice, such a voice as yours." Obviously, the musical Lothario's ulterior motives mean that we should not read such fawning at face value, yet we can infer from these and other textual details that Luis indeed is a relatively able vocalist. The musical instruction he goes on to receive revolves mainly around the guitar, suggesting that his voice needs little training, even as Loaysa promises to expand his limited repertoire with more prestigious songs. Foregrounding the distinction between the sonic and semantic, if Luis's singing voice is wanting, then it is not in terms of its timbre, but in his knowledge of lyrics. Overall, the text places less emphasis on the content of the songs that he and Loaysa intone than on the purely acoustic pleasure they generate. The most noteworthy material aspect of Luis's voice is its pitch, described by Loaysa as atiplada, or high-pitched. Underscoring Cervantes' keen interest in vocality, this is the first recorded usage of the adjective atiplada in the Spanish language, appearing previously only in the nominal form of tiple. And the term tiple, in fact, was often used in choral records to designate male sopranos, who could be either countertenors or the more prestigious castrati. The musicologist Martha Feldman offers a lush portrayal of what the castrato voice might have sounded like. Quote, "The ideal voice we might imagine has a lustrous surface, potentially powerful, potentially majestic, potentially brilliant, potentially silvery or metallic, potentially liquid, yet never necessarily any and certainly not all of those things. Perhaps, too, all those voices had something unique, something not shared by the voices of women or uncastrated men, as observers over a long period of time often remarked," end quote. As this synesthetic recreation implies, male voices occupying this highest vocal range were highly regarded and attained wide popular appeal in European classical and operatic traditions. But renewed interest among musicologists and cultural historians has produced a vibrant body of scholarship on castrati that is revising our understanding of these prized, yet often socially marginalized singers. For a time almost invisible to modern historiography, recent archival work has established that the presence of castrati in early modern Europe was more robust, extensive, and diverse than previously acknowledged. Traditionally regarded as a fixture of Italian Baroque opera beginning at the turn of the 17th century, evidence now suggests that castrati were exercising their vocation a century earlier, when a vogue for polyphonic choral music and ecclesiastic constraints on women jump-started the demand for male sopranos. From the outset, Spain was the major supplier of these singers to Italian chapel choirs, including Giacomo Spagnoletto, who as early as 1518 was employed in the Sistine Chapel, and Francisco Soto de Langa, who garnered fame in the papal choir from 1562 until his retirement in 1611. Archival testimony of emasculated performers in Spain is somewhat fragmented and understudied, but there is evidence of capones, or castrated singers in Iberia, significantly earlier. A document from the Cathedral of Burgos, for example, instructs ecclesiastic authorities as early as 1506 to bring young castrated boys with a, quote, good voice into the choir. Other textual sources from a wide range of genres indicate that castrated male singers were something of a commonplace, particularly in certain cathedrals, and were widespread enough to kindle debates over their morality and legality, such as whether they should be permitted to marry. Miguel Bartolomé's Salón published in 1592 what appears to be the earliest extant commentary on the legitimacy of emasculation for expressly musical ends, concluding that it was permissible only if consensual and for the common good. As we have already seen, Huerta de San Juan devotes several lines to discussing eunuchs, while denigrating them as lacking in wit and creativity due to a cold and dry disposition. He remarks tellingly that music, quote, is their ordinary profession. Across the Atlantic, too, castrati by the 1570s were being employed in such colonial centers as Mexico City, Puebla, Lima, Quito, and Cusco. Literary references to Spanish castrati corroborate their prevalence, including among Cervantes' contemporaries Francisco de Quevedo, Lope de Vega, and Vicente Espinel. The humanist Francisco de Cascales lauded castrati in his Defensa de los Capones Cantores, or Defense of Singing Castrates, in much more protracted fashion, while Francisco Narváez de Velilla's early 17th century Diálogo intitulado El Capón, or dialogue entitled The Castrate, subjected castrati to seething invective, demonstrating that by defying normative expectations around gender and ability, these individuals were not universally accepted, even as their voices captivated a growing audience. Castrati, in sum, were such active fixtures of performance and the public imaginary that Cervantes could have drawn inspiration from real-life castrati in endowing Luis with such a distinctive, richly detailed, and high-pitched voice. Now, for any Cervantistas in the audience that may be getting nervous, allow me to state for the record that Cervantes never refers to Luis as a castrado. Following a strict textual interpretation, nor is there anything in the narrative besides the fertile descriptions of his high-pitched voice to imply he might have been one before coming to serve in Carrizales' household. Certain other details would appear to militate against the very proposition, such as the fact that the eunuch doorman possesses a limited repertoire of songs, and that the romances, or ballads he does know, are a far cry from the hymns, chamber cantatas, and other sacred and elite music in which true castrati would presumably have been versed. Hypothetically, the case could be made that his prepubertal castration was executed for a musical career that never materialized, especially if we understand Lois's role as Luis's musical tutor, not just as the elaborate deception that it is, but also as a racialized imbalance of power that manifests between white master and black enslaved pupil, and that therefore might tend to further magnify for early modern readers the apparent expertise of the former at the expense of the latter's. Indeed, in Villancicos, among other places, Afro-descendant musicians were consistently derided as unskilled, strident, and cacophonous. That the narration and dialogue deprive Luis of a history, in effect, also mirrors the fragmented archive of historical castrati, particularly those who were enslaved, leaving the door ajar, as it were, to that imaginative scenario. As a purely literary castrato, I find the character productive for thinking about a number of related questions, which to my knowledge have not been thus posed by musicologists or historians, and which I think may also have productive implications for how we think about early modern disability. How do we distinguish between a bona fide professional castrato and an imposter, especially when the latter is already reified in the falsettist? Is professional castrato a pleonasm and amateur castrato an oxymoron? Or does castrato presuppose a distinction that is biological, was gonadectomized, functional vocational, was remunerated for singing, ontological, was earmarked early on for a vocal career and emasculated for that exclusive purpose, or some combination of these? Each of these distinctions presents methodological challenges, above all for the enslaved. Once again, the historical record is not always clear on whether male sopranos have been castrated. Some enslaved castrati were compensated even handsomely for their vocal performances, while others were not. And rarely, if ever, do we have unmediated access to the intrinsic motivations of a parent or owner for castrating a son or young enslaved male, even if we can deduce an overall rationale of social mobility or economic opportunism. Many castrati received from choir masters rigorous technical training in tone, harmony, breath control, and musical performance, yet others were recruited for choral singing merely on the basis of having been castrated, with little to no initial musical knowledge. And the lack of a standard choral curriculum means that such differences are quantitative at best. In posing these questions, what I wish to amplify is that how we designate a historical castrato as such is often contingent, and that therefore Luis may belong on a more inclusive spectrum, spanning from recreational singers to virtuosos. Approaching vocal ability not as an absolute, I suggest, also helps us get away from a deficit model by which castration supposes the loss of normal masculine vocality. The castrato voice created sonic possibilities unavailable to women, who were excluded from many performance contexts, and to countertenors, whose falsetto was often considered less powerful and resonant. In this sense, castration enabled a form of vocal virtuosity that challenges the framing of disability exclusively through absence and loss, creating instead a value that is irreducible to able-bodied norms. By placing Luis on a spectrum with castrati, I read Cervantes' description of Luis's high-pitched voice as neither inconsequential detail, sign of degradation, nor mere compensation for castration, but as a form of disabled embodiment that transcends the limitation of uncastrated male voices. With this proposition, I am not so much advancing a counter-history or critical fabulation that would supply the character a reparative backstory, as I am proposing what, building on Saidiya Hartman's terminology, we might call creative auscultation. In this spirit, listening to Luis's voice, qua that of a castrato, discloses the hybridity of the character and challenges longstanding assumptions about Cervantes' text and the larger, complex history of identity in Iberia and beyond. Critics who have remarked on Luis at all typically either assign him a symbolic function of representing a generic ahistorical other, or else insert him into an interpretation of Carrizales' household as a structural allegory of Ottoman cultural practices. This latter reading is supported by several details in El celoso extremeño and in Cervantes' own life. Among others, Carrizales is addressed as El Gran Señor, the same sobriquet applied to the Ottoman Sultan. The house is explicitly referred to as a seraglio or serrallo, and men are denied access to a domestic interior reserved for women and guarded by a eunuch in the manner of a harem, in addition to other biographical details about Cervantes' life and work. Justifiably, all of these factors inflect the critical inclination to situate Luis as another piece of this broader cultural typology, and Corey Reed and Nick Jones have both explored this angle quite fruitfully. Yet we need not look to other shores of the Mediterranean to find eunuchs, nor should we assume that Luis was patterned on those of the Sublime Porte, even if they made a significant impression on Cervantes. Despite a critical habit of passing them off as foreign imports, emasculated boys and men were homegrown realities of Christian Europe and of Iberia in particular. Sebastián de Covarrubias's Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana o Española, the first European vernacular dictionary and published 2 years before El celoso extremeño, is revealing in this regard. Nowhere among the entries for Spanish words related to castration, including castrar, capón, espadón, eunuco, and the extensively glossed capar, does the early lexicographer make even a passing reference to the Ottoman Empire, citing instead copious contemporary, biblical, and ancient Roman and Greek examples. Just as revealing, Covarrubias's modern editors nonetheless elected to supplement the entry for capar in their illustrated edition of 2006 with the reproduction of an engraving of Turkish eunuchs from Paul Ricoeur's Histoire de l'état présent de l'Empire ottoman of 1670. In true Saidian fashion, this example betrays a kind of reflexive Orientalism that subtly disavows domestic human castration by externalizing and exoticizing its origins, thus displacing questions of moral legitimacy onto a foreign, less civilized other. My intention in highlighting such maneuvers is not to domesticate Cervantes' story, but to short-circuit presumptive lines of transmission for a character embodying not just eunuchism, but also blackness, enslavement, disability, and musicality. Much like the Orientalist tendency to chalk prepubertal castration up to the Ottoman East, a set of racialized assumptions have traditionally neglected and distorted the presence of Black Africans in Iberia, whether in the service of papering over Spain's complicity in the trafficking of the enslaved, which relates to the Black legend, of course, or perpetuating white fantasies about European music. If we challenge these tendencies, as a growing body of scholarship is urging us to do, we find there is nothing necessarily foreign or exotic about a Black eunuch musician in Seville, the setting of El celoso extremeño. Luis de Peraza's mid-16th century history attests to the diversity of the port city and bustling commercial gateway to the Atlantic, already decades before Cervantes' novella, noting the presence of, quote, enslaved Moors, Christian and infidel from all parts of Africa, and an infinite multitude of Black men and women from all parts of Ethiopia and Guinea, end quote. Likewise, 16th century Afro-Iberian performers contributed meaningfully to a diverse range of courtly, liturgical, and popular music and dance traditions. Many served as heraldic musicians in royal and noble households, sung in parish chapels, and performed as trumpeters and drummers at various institutional and religious ceremonies across the peninsula. Less formally, their melodies and rhythms enlivened the soundscape of public streets and squares. According to Peraza, one neighborhood of Seville became known as the Drum District, Barrio de la Tambor, thanks to the Black Africans who congregated there on Sundays to play music. The city's Black confraternities raised funds for charitable outreach to the enslaved by performing music and dance in the city streets. Many other enslaved Afro-descendants received musical instruction in plain chant, served as choir boys, or performed as chapel singers. Very recent scholarship and archival research suggests that enslaved Black vocalists and Black male sopranos in particular were likewise a far more common reality of early modernity than previously thought. Sarah Finley describes several such singers who were active in the late 16th and early 17th century in the cathedrals of Puebla and Mexico City, while Wilborn reconstructs the life of Giovannino Bonaccorsi, an enslaved Black castrato installed at the Medici court from at least 1651 until his death in 1674. And according to Wilborn, this is Bonaccorsi to the right of the painting. In the early modern trade of enslaved people, those with musical skills commanded a premium. These castrati could fetch wages rivaling those of their white peers, and thus, in the words of Finley, quote, beckon explorations of vocal commodification and its relationship to bodies in bondage. These questions also reveal a central paradox in how disabled people, and castrati in particular, were simultaneously valued and devalued, exploited and excluded. Castrati labor was intensively commodified. Their voices generated economic value for choir masters, patrons, opera houses, and enslavers, yet this exploitation coexisted with profound social stigmatization. The commodification of Black male sopranos also reveals how enslavement and disability intersect to render certain bodies valuable precisely through their exploitation, perhaps exemplifying what disability scholars like Tobin Siebers call the supercrip paradox. Disabled individuals whose extraordinary achievements are simultaneously celebrated and used to justify continued marginalization. A prized voice makes a castrato valuable as property while ensuring his continued bondage. His musical skill generates aesthetic pleasure for others while he remains confined. Luis embodies this economic logic whereby disability becomes valuable only insofar as it can be extracted and commodified. He is functionally useful to carrizales, valuable enough to purchase and maintain, yet this value does not translate into freedom, dignity, or recognition of his full personhood. The history of castrati thus illuminates ongoing dynamics of disability and capitalism, wherein certain disabled bodies are rendered hypervisible and valuable in specific contexts, while remaining socially abject. In drawing these remarks to a close, it would be reductive to conclude that Cervantes modeled Luis on historical castrati, as the narrative ambiguities of the character productively vex critical attempts at fixing him a definitive origin. Yet if on one hand such ambiguities are quintessentially Cervantine, then on the other they make the character more historically responsive, not less. I am referring not only to the violently obscured origins of the enslaved, but also to the castrati, whose own provenance and professional trajectories are rarely straightforward. Bonnie Gordon, quote, positions the castrato as living sonic borderlands, singing on the cusp of the West and the rest, while Martha Feldman suggests, quote, we might think of the whole existence of castrati as being structurally caught betwixt and between, end quotes. These would seem exceptionally apt figurations for a character forced to dwell in a vestibule straddling a domestic interior and public exterior, and whose raced, gendered, and differently abled identities also situate Luis as a liminal yet eminently intersectional figure. In sum, listening to Luis as a castrato allows us to hear the violence of castration, enslavement, and musical labor together, and to grapple with a convergence of racially marked and historically marginalized others. What would it take to imagine other early modern eunuchs on a spectrum similar to that which I have described for Cervantes' character of Luis? What value might there be in approaching castrated individuals' vocal ability not as an absolute distinction between professional castrati and the rest, but as points on a spectrum? These questions challenge us to move beyond binary categorizations of ability and disability, professional and amateur, loss and compensation. Ultimately, Luis's voice and the disabled, racialized, enslaved body from which it emerges challenges us to listen differently to early modern soundscapes and to the bodies that produced them. His confinement to the vestibule, that liminal architectural space between interior and exterior, produces disability through spatial restriction, transforming bodily difference into social isolation. Yet within this confinement, Luis's voice resonates, passing through walls, generating auditors, asserting presence. However constrained by the structures of enslavement and ableist commodification, this sonic assertion reminds us that disabled voices, and especially those of enslaved, disabled people of color, have always been present in spaces that sought to silence them. In listening to Luis, we confront uncomfortable truths about the violence foundational to aesthetic ability, the exploitation inherent in musical commodification, and the ongoing legacies of intersecting oppressions that continue to shape whose voices are heard. Thank you.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about the other slaves in the house, like particularly the white girl slaves?
Yes, thank you for that question. Luis, of course, is not the only one. There is an entire staff of enslaved people at the service of Carrizales, and there are enslaved people described as white slaves, as well as black slaves, Luis and Guiomar. Guiomar is described as a bozal who speaks in Habla de Negros, which Nick Jones has, as many of us know, explored at great length, right? This stilted, Africanized Castilian speech that is deployed parodically in the text, right? So it is important to acknowledge the presence of Guiomar in particular. The presence of the white slaves, too, might lead us to allegorize the domestic fortress as an Ottoman harem, given the racialized distinction between eunuchs around the Sultan's palace that, again, has been explored very fruitfully by Hamid Arvas, for example. So there are a lot of dynamics at play, as is so often the case with Cervantes' writing. There's a lot of fundamental ambiguities and ambivalences, right? Which I hope I've demonstrated that in Luis's voice itself is kind of spanning that dialectic between ability, disability, liberation, oppression. I don't know if that
I was just curious because I was trying to think, where these three white slaves come from, and I never was able to find anything. But the Bozal is clear, yes, I understand. And also the Bozal, Guiomar, is being discriminated because he doesn't speak Spanish well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
Right.
But do you get in Porras, in the so-called Manuscrito de Porras, something different from what you just explained?
Yeah, there are some interesting differences there. Not so much, if I'm not mistaken, about Luis in particular, but there has been a lot of discussion among philologists and Cervantes scholars about the differences between the Porras manuscript. For me, the fact, again, that the white slaves and the black enslaved members of that household are not ascribed an origin is very historically responsive, right? That's what we would expect from not just an enslaved member of that household, but also a eunuch or even a castrato, as the case would be. Yeah. Timothy Foster has a book that explores in some detail the musical context of the novella as well. Cervantes does give some more detail about the songs that Luis plays on the guitar, Moorish ballads, and the provenance of those. So that introduces another element there that allows us to maybe trace speculatively where the character might derive from, even though, again, Cervantes never specifies his point of origin.
Thank you so much. I have no pun intended, some discordant thoughts about, in general, about that I'd love to ask you, but probably need more time to just think them through. But one, I love the idea of, the attention that you're giving to kind of the vestibular space, especially because like the unlocking and locking of doors is so important in this text, in Maria de Sayas, and all of the Uxoricide dramas as well. Mm-hmm. So it's just really interesting too that then Luis is also like, there's like this unlocking that's happening within him when he like starts his musical education or whatever. But I was wondering in particular, another discordant thought first is just the whole idea of manquedad in this novella, but in the novelas ejemplares in general, but also just in all of the Cervantine kind of repertoire. Sorry, now all the musical, all the musical terms are coming to my head, but just the way that there's always this kind of generative element in the manquedad itself, just like these heridas that were won in the most beautiful battles. But my question is about kind of disability imposture, and I'm thinking about Lindsay Rowe Hayfield's work and Ellen Samuels as well, and just so thinking in particular about the enamored swain in this text who's kind of feigning illness and feigning things in order to have access to the vestibular kind of penetrate into the house. So I was just wondering, there's not imposture with Luis in and of himself, perhaps, but like maybe in the performativity of the Castrato in general. And then I was just the other, thing that I was thinking of too was just in opera lyrica, how many of these castrati, when you were talking about how he's removed kind of from the desire, and obviously he's the only male that's allowed in this enclosed space and who has that kind of vestibular past scene access, but how many of these castrati had these huge amounts of female followers who were very sexually interested in them. I think it's what's his name, Farinati, one of the famous castrati. But sorry, I know those are all over the place, but your talk was so wonderfully generative, so that's why I'm responding in this way.
No, thank you so much, Alani, for all those thoughts. I hadn't thought about the unlocking, but I think you're certainly right, metaphorically at least, that the invitation to play the guitar and to sing unlocks that kind of musical interest within Luis, and that's what I was sort of trying to allude to with thinking about the vestibule not just as a confining ideological mechanism, architectural disabling mechanism, but also as a pulmonary space, right, through which music emanates. I've explored in other venues the acousmatic sound. I've been really interested in how, for example, in captivity, right? Cervantes spent 5 years in captivity in Algiers, and a text like Antonio de Sosa's Topografía de Argel, he perambulates around the city, but his movements are restricted, right, as a captive, and so everything he hears becomes of prime importance. So on the one hand, that might seem to privilege the sense of hearing, but on the other, it restricts the availability of access to that information, right? And of course, with Loaysa, he hears Loaysa acousmatically to begin with, which also is a bit at odds with the fact that Loaysa does engage in this imposture. He disguises himself as a disabled street busker. And I've grappled with that for this project, what to do with that. And again, it's another piece. I kind of think through that in terms of Adriana Cavarero's work on the voice as uniqueness. And then Nina Sun Eidsheim has this fantastic book about exploring identity through acousmatic sound, and the classic example is Over the Telephone, right? The presumptions about what a voice sounds like, right? The gendered and racialized presumptions. But I've suggested that there were other acousmatic spaces in early modernity that would have produced similar instances of gendered and racialized assumptions around voices. The other, I'm also thinking about, Cervantes's military service in Lepanto, which I mentioned. In the Epistola Mateo Vázquez, he goes into great detail, I think, about that soundscape and the ongoing trauma of specifically the sounds of war that he experienced there. And those sounds recur repeatedly throughout his later works. So to what degree does that, I guess going back to Lois and the imposter, right, does that inflect the rest of the narrative with this sort of sense of performance versus authenticity? There's certainly a tension there. And of course that's reified in the falsetto, as I also suggested, right? The castrato, in that sense, would be an authentic voice. And in fact, by a lot of early modern commentators, was considered to be more authentic, more natural, because it was preserving a boy's natural timbre across time, which also makes me think back to Sonia's discussion of Crip time, right? Thinking about the castrato as preserving that as opposed to the changing voice through adolescence. The reference I would mention is think about the hypersexualized nature of castrati and their kind of early modern fandom. Roger Freitas has an excellent article exploring sexuality of eunuchs and castrati that really pushed back, I think, against that idea that they were devoid of both sexual interest and sexual desire. But thank you for all those thoughts.
Can I say 2 sentences?
Okay.
Sorry, thank you so much for bringing up the Topografía de Argel. And it just was making me think of, I mean, I hadn't put them in connection so much together, but the kind of interesting and different dynamics between this text and the Médico de su Honra, and the way that the king is overhearing the ballads about himself and like the flexibility as he moves throughout the city, and which gives such different attention to what songs Luis is actually singing.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, that's another great connection.
thank you so much. That was so generative.